Today, I want you to paint dull, muddy dahlias with me. And before you go, because you're convinced I'm creatively unwell, let me explain. Pencil and watercolor is a combo I'll never stop talking about. Today, we'll sketch in some detail, but then we'll finish things with some simple watercolor washes. It's finally dahlia season. My dahlia garden was a bit slow to come alive this year, but she's finally coming around. Today's look is vintage and dramatic. Some will call it muddy, and I kind of agree, because muddy watercolor, while being muted or maybe less sheer, can still be super enchanting and incredibly satisfying to experience and create. To celebrate this dahlia today, we're going to number 1, map basic shapes. Number 2, refine the shapes. Add shading. Number 3. Number 4, we're going to add the watercolor. And then number 5, we're going to add highlights. Let's take a look at all the pencils I'm going to have at hand today. First up, we have a Faber-Castell HB pencil. This is one of my absolute favorites. This little exercise that I'm going to do for each of these pencils is fantastic. I highly recommend. Basically, create a little splotch of really soft pencil shading. Try to make it as even and smooth of a transition as possible. Basically, that whole splotch should be the same darkness, and it's a really great technique to develop that you can create even, consistent shading in a particular area of your sketch. And then just from light touch to the hardest touch possible, create a squiggly line just to see the different types of marks that your pencil can make depending on how much pressure you're using. Next up is the Zebra Tect mechanical pencil. I love this one too. It is a great fine point. I'm often asked, how do I decide when to use a mechanical pencil versus a normal? And it's usually when I want a lot more control and often when I'm adding more final stage details. Pressure, though, really impacts a mechanical pencil. You can't press hard before that graphite point just breaks right off. Next, we have the Scott pencil. I don't know what this is actually called. I probably should have researched before I did this video. It's kind of like a mechanical pencil, but the lead or the graphite is much thicker, doesn't come to a fine point, but it is so lovely and consistent, and it glides across the page beautifully. It's definitely responsive to pressure, but not as responsive or as soft as some other pencils that I have. Next up, we have the Derwent pencil in a 2B. Now, I find this 2B to be a lot softer. Haha, did you get that? 2B? To be a lot softer than many other 2B pencils I've tried. Not sure why, but I enjoy this pencil for that reason. And it is super, super responsive to pressing harder. You can see that gorgeous thick line that we got. And then the really light touch line has a fabulous texture to it. Faber-Castell again, and this is a 4B. And I think it's so interesting. Again, notice how much lighter this actually is than the 2B Derwent 2B. It's crazy to me, but it's fun to see them side by side. This is a Faber-Castell Jumbo. It's a much thicker pencil, I guess is the best way to say it. And it has its moments for sure, and this is also a 2B. But look how different it applies to the paper. And speaking of paper, I am using Hot Press Academy watercolor paper today. The smooth finish is going to give me a lot more control, but also allow me to add some watercolor touches in a very stable and predictable way versus if I had chosen to use drawing paper. And while we're here, let's just take a brush load of juicy watercolor and see how each of these is reacting to having watercolor placed on top of them quite quickly. And so honestly, they're very stable. You're not seeing a lot of particles move around. A little bit with that Derwent, you can see some of the graphite particles kind of moving around a little bit, but really stable. But it's fun to see when this is all dry, if there are any changes, if there's any more kind of mixing of the graphite and the watercolor on the page. So definitely take a look at your sheet after it's dry and make some observations. Starting out with step number 1 here, the mapping out. I'm going much darker than I normally would simply because I want you to be able to see this well. This stage is typically done with a very, very light touch. And for me, it's all about figuring out the direction, the overall direction of clusters of this dahlia flower. So some clusters, for example, in the bottom right, there's a cluster that's all kind of curving just ever so slightly upward and to the right. And so I'm making note of that. And then we've got the top cluster that's very kind of symmetrical and fanning out across the top of the flower. And once you have a good sense of the general direction of all of these areas of your dahlia, you can go in like I am now and start to really go in confidently with a heavier stroke. Again, you could still be really light at this point, but I am going darker with my pressure so you can see what I'm doing, really see what I'm doing. I want to make a comment about this particular style of dahlia. This dahlia doesn't have a defined center. I don't know the name of this particular species, but it doesn't have like a ball center or anything very distinct in the middle. It's basically just the petals are all clustering together at the center. And so honestly, that can make creating this dahlia on the page a challenge because your eye wants to see a flower center, right? So feel free to add your own center. I'm going ahead with how I see it pretty much in real life. And friends, if you're wondering, I will link below an inspiration photo of the live dahlia that I'm working from right now. All right, let's go in and start refining these shapes. Choose one petal on your inspiration photo and start there. Try to replicate that first one petal that you've decided on as accurately as you can. Notice at the middle of the petal, is it wider than the base of the petal or the tip of the petal? Take a look at how long that one petal is and make some comparisons. Are the petals underneath it and around it shorter, longer, or about the same? And then once you've established that one strong petal, start to build out from there. And this is where I typically go rogue. I typically stop looking at my flower or my inspiration photo as much at this point. I just start to choose where things overlap. So again, my first petal was in that upper right corner, so to speak, with this flower. And then I also was careful about that teeny tiny little petal that was right at the center of the flower. But after that, friends, I just started to create petals that overlapped and underlapped each other. And I decided where and how. But I was always thinking back to the mapping underneath this sketch and making sure that I was kind of following the general direction of those clusters of petals that I mapped out earlier, because that's going to help keep this sketch having a more natural, realistic-ish vibe. Something that I do all the time is I will notice different petals, parts of petals that I really love the personality of. So for example, at the bottom, some of those petals have little notches in them. Some of them curl and curve really beautifully around and underneath each other. And I might then exaggerate those details of the petals. So go for it. Find 2 or 3 or 5 petals that you really love and exaggerate ever so slightly the personality parts of those petals that really made them stand out to you. Friends, I'm all about basic shapes. You know this when it comes to sketching. I love thinking about teardrop shapes and how we could refine them to make our flowers and landscapes and all the things look a bit more realistic. I am not a realist artist, but I do want my things to look like the thing, right? You get what I'm saying? Maybe. To get the look of petals that are kind of emanating from a center that you can never really see the full structure of because it's like underneath the flower. You just want to make sure that your petals get skinnier, for the most part, as they go towards the center of the flower. Then, as a general rule, your petals are going to get thicker at their midsection and then thinner again at their tips. Now this applies mostly for a top-down or full frontal view of a flower. Well, that sounded a little risque, but it also applies in general. Even if your flower is a little bit tipped forward towards you or tipped back, even a little bit of a 3/4 view, the general rule applies. let's think about it another way. It's basically thin, thick, thin. So as the petal is disappearing into the center, it's thin, and then it gets thicker as it comes towards you. And then when it really reaches you, when it's closest to you, the tip of that petal, it's its thinnest. Perspective can be scary and complicated, and my description just now was a really simplified way to think about it. But in general, when you're stylizing flowers or landscapes or any subject matter, that really helps to kind of pare it down, simplify the concept, because that's what stylized artwork is. It's figuring out how to successfully and convincingly simplify a shape, a petal, a blade of grass, and give that shape personality without taking away from its basic form. I have a few other videos where I get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of forming shapes, petals, flowers specifically. I'm gonna link them below. Definitely worth your time to dive into those when you have a few moments. All right, our next step, once you've got all of your petals in and you're happy with the structure and the basic look of everything, is to start adding some basic shading. And I say basic because I'm gonna give you one principle, kind of one rule, general, I'm saying rule with a really, really light tongue, to follow as you're adding these shadows. And remember the exercise we did at the beginning of this video where I had you create that little blob or patch of really even shaded pencil strokes? That's the same technique that you're gonna use now to add your basic shading. Notice there at the top right, I choose that one petal, and where that petal meets with others, I make a little dark area, and I go over and over and over again, just like I did in the exercise, letting my pencil just kind of whisk above, just touching the surface of my paper over and over again. The darkness is its most dark where those petals kind of meet and converge, and then it slowly lightens up as I get away from where those petals converge towards the tip of the petal. And you can follow that general rule all around your flower. As I go, I'm adding little lines and details that follow the contour or the silhouette of the petal. I don't do that everywhere though. I definitely am mindful to not shade each petal in exactly the same way. You'll notice sometimes I'm shading half of the petal. Sometimes I'm literally just adding a little bit of shading at the base of the petal where it's starting to converge with other petals. Variety is really the spice of life here when it comes to a stylized sketch with a little bit of shading, and that's essentially what we're doing. You don't want to do it the same way on every petal, or it just really doesn't give the viewer anything to get super excited about visually. Any of the shapes that your darkest shading moments are touching, you can refine them by kind of notching into those other shapes with your dark shadow. All right, friends. Are these descriptions helping you? I know I'm very wordy, and I hope that the way that I say things makes sense. So let me know in comments now. Makes sense, Kristy? I'm with you. Whatever you want to tell me in comments so that I know it's working. Or honestly, if there's a way I'm describing something that was confusing, call me out and I will try to clarify when I answer your comment. If you're having any sort of fun and getting any sort of value out of this, or have had an aha moment, I invite you to give this video a boop. Friends, that's a like. And if you're new here, I call it a boop just because I like to rename things. It's a really weird habit. Anywho, and you know what? If you'd like to, hit that bell icon and subscribe so you never miss an upload here. All right, I'm gonna give you some creative peace as I finish up the shading in this sketch. And yeah, that means I'm gonna shut my mouth for a few moments. All right, moving on. I feel really good about the shading on the flower, but do you see what I mean about it not having a very specific center and how that's a little confusing to the eye? But I'm gonna sit with it and be okay with it because that is the flower I chose. Anywho, friends, I'm going in now. I've switched from that Scott pencil, which I love for mapping out, shading, all of the things. It's really fun. But I went to my Zebra mechanical pencil because I felt like I wanted a little bit of variety. I wanted a really fine line for adding this greenery. Also adding a little bud at the bottom there, and then right back with that Scott pencil, and I'm going in for the shading, bringing out the 4B and really digging in. My lines are getting a lot scratchier now, and this is by design. I love variety. I love contrast. And here comes that Derwent 2B, which is so dark and so buttery, velvety in texture. It's so good. And look at that smudge. Look at that smudge. Again, back to variety. Variety of line weight makes a composition interesting. Variety of pressure so that you can start to see the texture that happens in a thicker pencil line. Fantastic. Right here, right now, at this point in this artwork is why I introduced you to the idea of pulling out a bunch of different pencils and using a bunch of different pencils, because it's gonna create interest in your composition and it's gonna make interest in your composition easy. Easy, why, you might ask? Because just by the nature of picking up a different pencil and making a different kind of line in this greenery area, I have improved my composition because the eye now is not going to get bored, or as bored as it might have gotten if I just continued with the same style of adding details and shadows as I used with the entire flower. Are you still with me, friends? Head to comments, let me know, say still with me. I am in love with this Derwent pencil for adding some unexpected, really bold, almost painterly. If a pencil could be painterly, it would be this pencil. So I'm going in and adding some really lyrical, romantic leaves and some swirly kind of short vines, and yeah, a couple swirls actually too. And it is just what this composition needed. There is such a lovely balance now. Okay, let's review. We mapped the basic shapes, we refined those shapes, we added our shading, and it's time for number 4, the watercolor. This is the point in this particular piece where you take your breath. You've made it. You've created something that's really exciting and kind of feels like, yeah, that looks like the flower I was trying to paint, or, well, we're not painting it, we're drawing. Anyway, friends, this is the point where you can relax those shoulders, take a breath, take a beat, and be proud of yourself. All right, here we go, a wet on dry. I am gonna be rinsing my brush here and there, but not over rinsing. I went right into that pink. My brush still had peach on it. And I'm just kind of like coloring in my artwork, friends, I'm not gonna lie. Sheer, 1 layer, maybe 2 when we get into it. Towards the bottom of the flower, I'm noticing in general, things are more pink. I'm looking at my real flower now, right? Towards the top of the flower, things are more yellow. So I'm just gonna follow that basic pattern, but keeping mindful of the fact that I don't want to cause too much friction between brush and paper because I want to really maintain that beautiful graphite finish. I am using my number 6 cat's tongue, and I'm gonna have a little more information about that cat's tongue below because I know you're gonna ask, so check below. And again, let's have some quiet time. Kristy, zip it. Friends, I love finishing up with this moment where I'm adding just straight watercolor brush strokes. No pencil. These areas are just a little touch, a little visual rest from all of the pencil watercolor combo, and it just feels like the right decision. Mwah! Chef's kiss. Love it. A few little bouncy strokes on some of those bottom petals, just a touch of a second layer here, the same in the top petals, just to intensify that peachy color a bit. But notice the brevity of my strokes. I get the color on the brush, I put the brush down on the paper, 1-2 swipes maybe, and I'm out of there. All right, it is time for step 5, and that's the highlights. We're gonna be using bleed proof white, which I like to think of basically as a really strong white gouache. Bleed proof white is water soluble, so it's going to re-wet and wet down just like watercolor would, but in general is way more opaque than typical classic watercolor. This is where I'm bringing out that liner brush, and I am loading up the brush 60% bleed proof white, 40% water. And now you're gonna figure out your perfect ratio, but I like to give that as a guide. And friends, you're probably gonna be reloading often because even though this is hot press paper, it is watercolor paper, so it is going to soak up the white. Think of this as loose gestural sketching with your brush. You are not gonna have a ton of control over this brush, especially if you're new to this brush. I'm gonna link some liner brush drills below if you wanna watch those first. But friends, you're just gonna bounce around the page, keep your arm loose, and you're going to be very selective about where you're adding these highlights. Let's take a look at exactly how I did it. Going back to that petal I started with from the very first step with sketching, and I'm starting at kind of the base of the petal where everything's converging and stroking upwards following the silhouette. Then heading down into the middle and just adding a touch of highlight to that teeny tiny petal that is the closest thing that we have to a center of this flower. Back up to the top, working from the point or the outermost area of the petal downward, and notice only half of the petal, being very selective. Going in here over on the right and adding just a few touches. Now this leaf is dark, so I'm gonna go really, really bold here, and I'm gonna fill this whole leaf with linear details. Gorgeous. Boom, pop. Down at the bottom, a few dots and dashes, a few linear details following the curvature, the silhouette of that petal. A few more dots. Be very instinctive here. Dance around. If you find yourself kind of overdoing it, take a breath, take a beat, step back. I am literally on the fine razor edge of overdoing it there at the bottom portion of this flower. I gotta get out of there. A little bit more on that leaf that's pointing very much downwards. Oh, I love those beautiful strong white lines against the darker green, but only half of that leaf, and then on over to the bud and really gestural there. If you're wondering what I mean by gestural, really important video, I'm gonna link below, check it out. And then some more white over on that big leaf on the left, and a little bit more curved with the detailing there, not so straight and structural. And we are almost at it here, friends. I really gotta pull myself out of this. It's important because when you start to add detail and you're loving the detail and you feel like it looks good, it is so easy at that point to overdo it. So just keep that in mind. Can you hear the excitement in my voice? Like I literally am like jumping out of my creative skin right now. Going back in, yes, with the Derwent pencil because she my new BFF, and adding the last moments of darkness for that last bit of contrast and pop and drama right at the center there, because again, this flower is really giving me a hard time with the center. Little bit at the top with just some light outline sketches of petals just to finally refine the shape of the overall flower. A few really light leaves in the bottom left, and then some more here at the top right. And friends, this is it. This is the cherry on top. I love it so much. Another little bud down here. I am not going to be filling these in with paint, friends. This is again back to that idea of variety of format, variety of material, variety of line weight. Variety is the spice of your compositional life. Get the variety. I am standing at this point I've got a loose arm and I am just evaluating. Where do things need to pop? And I feel like my flower proper is just fading into the greenery, right? So I'm gonna go in with this Derwent pencil and I am just gonna scrub up some areas where that flower, the outer edge of the flower, meets the greenery. I'm not gonna scrub the whole leaf. I'm just gonna scrub right where the petal and leaf meet in a few areas, and look at that. Instantly pop, pop, drama. Love it, love it. And I'm not being precious. I'm scrubbing, I'm scrumbling, I'm scumbling. I don't know what it's called. It's one of those words, but it works, friends. You're just kind of using some heavy pressure to get the darkest shade out of that pencil and then moving on. Boom. So good. Friends, give this video a boop if you are as excited as I am now. And let me know in comments, oh, I'm trying this, because I really hope you will. And don't worry if that bleed proof white isn't fully dry. Notice how there at the bottom on that bud, that bleed proof white wasn't dry and it just blended right in with my graphite. I actually have a thing for working dry pencil into wet watercolor, and that is the next video you should watch. And here it is, friends. And until next time, oh my gosh, happy painting!